So where I am right now, just give a good look, is at the Hornets Nest. So you can see you are here. So right along that road was the Hornets Nest. This is right in the middle of it all. So just walk a few paces this way. You can see that monument. And you can see the picket fence. And the picket fence runs all the way up to the Duncans field, where I was, and that's where Sherman was. So right along this ridge would be called, well, right in here would be called the Hornets Nest. Now right up there, you can kind of see the red thing. Move all the way over to the left where you can see that white monument. That's where the start of the Confederate barrage started. There were artillery there, and they went all the way across. I'm sure this was probably far more open back then. They went all the way across to barrage here. They held out here. Eventually, when the flanks of both the Union right and left gave in, the Confederates were able to surround the Hornets Nest, and closing in on all sides, they were able to get 2,200 Union soldiers to surrender. But not after they inflicted a lot of heavy losses on the Confederates for their troubles. So they hid behind all these oak trees, and I guess the Confederates didn't really have much in the way of cover. I'm guessing most of these trees were gone. I mean, most of those are all really young. So here's Iowa, 4th Infantry. There's another one further up. All these are obviously 2 munitions battery. Yes, there were a couple divisions, many of them piecemeal because they had been driven back and there was a little confusion. Here's a monument to the Confederate States of America troops, erected by the Daughters of the Confederacy in the early 1900s. Amazing how most of the Confederate monuments all kind of fall around that time. Whatever was going on. Actually, I do know what was going on, but I'm not going to get into a big history lesson. A list of all the regiments that were here. And you can see on back there, there's another one, and there's another one, and if you keep going on this road, which you're not allowed to drive on, you would find monument after monument for the Union divisions, which, well, not divisions, regiments, which fought and repulsed, and then were under heavy fire bombardment for an hour before they either escaped or surrendered, or were killed. Yes, on this Shiloh thing, I started with the Hornets Nest. The main thing with more footage from the Hornets Nest is that it was such a crucial point of the battle. It really defined the battle. Whenever you look at the Battle of Shiloh, they'll always talk about the Hornets Nest. So I honestly put a picture here just so people could understand. Now, the most knowledge about the battle is all about day one. And that's because, well, basically we know a lot more about the Union side because the Union obviously won, and a lot of those generals and whatnot were taking diaries about what was going on. Day two would be, I guess, a lot more, not as memorable because, again, this was the Union pushing them back, and it was just kind of just a general just push right back. And then after, Beauregard basically figured out that he had lost the battle. He just orderly retreat. It wasn't a desperate battle to try and stave off, as day one was, the Union to stave off destruction. As soon as the South realized that there was no way they were going to win because of Buell's reinforcements, they just withdrew from the battlefield and it was over. Of course, the thing is that Grant didn't pursue because he was under orders not to. So here, there's actually 2 parts to this place. This is Duncans Farm. So right up there on that hill was a farmhouse, and that's where Duncans Farm was. Now, after the initial push of the Confederates, when they surprised the Union Army, they fell back to this farm. They made their first real defensive line right along this ridge. That's where they were going to hold. And they held out here for several hours, like 7 hours. They held out here. some of the worst fighting was here. Most brutal fighting was here. The fence, not sure if it was here. Probably not. But anyway, all along here, this farm was where basically the right flank, well, wasn't not really the right, but it was near the center of the Union Army. Those trees off into the distance, right where the fence is, that's the Hornets Nest. That would be the dense center of the Union Army and where they would hold out and eventually get enveloped. Basically what ended up happening is they were eventually forced out by just sheer number of troops, and they were running low on ammunition. Plus the Southerners outnumbered them because the Confederates had made a great mistake in the fact that they thought this was the left flank of the Union, and so they were pushing hard. They were actually pressing hard against the center. They would later find out that the Union line actually extended a lot further on. Now this does have a place in day 2. On day 2, what happens is this happens to be the defensive line of the Southerners. So they pushed them back all the way to the landing, and this is where they hung up. They retreated some so they'll be outside their gun range. And they thought like they were going to start off, but instead the Union attacks them at 8 a.m. And basically the battle plays out in reverse the next time. Now it's the Southerners who are surprised, and they are driven back. The thing about it is their general, the highest ranking officer to ever die in the Civil War, dies here. He gets shot, a bullet passes through his knee and suffers the artery, and he bleeds out in basically 20 minutes. See, you are here. Union came right up, 9 a.m. Boom, and hit them. They desperately try, but eventually they start to retreat by 11. So the Union was here at 11 a.m. So at 9 a.m. on the first day, the Union makes this their defensive line and retreats closer to 4 p.m. Heavy duty. Okay, here we're on the other side of Duncans Field, and as you can see, all the cannon, something special happened here. This was where the left flank of the Confederates set up their cannon to fire at those trees, which was the Hornets Nest. Right over there would be Duncans Farm. Over there would be the Hornets Nest. Now, they actually set up more cannons than had ever been done in North American history, and fired for a full hour on the Hornets Nest, basically pinning down the Union soldiers there, actually giving time for the Confederate infantry to surround them on both sides to kind of force a surrender. Had the cannons not been firing, probably a lot more Union troops would have escaped and been able to retreat. They said they had them pinned down the whole time because the fire was so great. I'm sure that some of those things there in the kind of signify the Hornet's Nest. But I'm just walking over here to see this. They had a lot of cannon. Of course, it would be upstaged by, like, I think Gettysburg. Probably some other battles too. And the line was held from 11 a.m. 6. Yes, this is where infantry, Union infantry, on the first day was stationed to hold the line from Illinois. The first day to hold the farm, Duncans Farm, they were up here. And the way they say it is that there was a lot of they were forced back, and then they would counterattack, force back, counterattack. So the battle lines were here's the other thing about these battles is that it wasn't like a running battle. Usually you'd force the enemy back, they would they would run back, you'd try and overrun them if you could. If not, they'd fall back to some other position where they'll set up the defensive lines, and then you would battle there. They tried to keep it as organized as possible. Here we are on the Union left. This was all what they call Bell's Farm. A hastily defense by the Union forces put it right here. And you can see where batteries were set up. Now, this is on the first day they came down. You could tell there were about 7,000 Union with 8,300 Confederates who came over down through here. They crossed a large cotton field beyond an orchard. This was all farmland, so there were trees there. Counterattack. This was where Johnson got fatally wounded and was brought over back over there. That's where his monument is. Heavy fighting continued for 2 more hours until they were basically forced to retire back through the camps to Pittsford's Landing. The Confederates on foot now moved against the Federals defending Hornets Nest. So when they were finally forced back far enough, they turned and swiveled and took Hornets Nest, which still hadn't fallen. Johnson spent too much time moving, like not realizing how strong the Union left flank was when he thought he was fighting the center, and he wasted too much time attacking the Hornets Nest, and then he finally moved left and was able to force them to take Hornets Nest and to force them back. He was unable to take Pittsford's Landing. Was it Pittsford's Landing? Oh, God. Yeah, Pittsburgh's Landing. If he had taken Pittsburgh Landing, the battle would have ended the following day with Grant's surrender. Okay, so here's the battlefield. This is the last line. Along this road, along those batteries, are on the first day of battle, on April 6th. This is the last point of where Grant retreated to. I'm assuming those trees weren't there. 3 guns of the battery were engaged here Sunday afternoon and remained in position all night. This would be the end of the line. This would be as far as the Union Army would retreat. Okay? I'll have to put up things about it. And this is where they would start their counterattacks from. It's where the infantry was. The Army of Tennessee. Ah, that bike is pretty. Now it's only drizzling. The real storms are going on a little south. They're getting pounded. Here's a monument to Ohio. Brave of the brave, twice for these 1,000 men who shall this day stood in the battle shock. Fame holds dear the throne. Yeah, nice little poem. There's the regiments from Iowa that were engaged. So all along this line. 17th Infantry. Each of those markers. That's for the people of Iowa. Iowa was well represented in this area. This regiment arrived on the battlefield at 12 o'clock in the night. Too late to participate in the battle. Was in the line of the battle the morning of the 8th. Illinois. Each mark where they were. 51st Regiment, Indiana. Army of the Ohio. So here's where the counterattack, initially it actually did push the Confederates back. However, the Confederates were able, under Hardee, to do a counterattack on the counterattack onto the right flank of the Union, which destroyed the counterattack and forced the Union Army to retreat. Now after this counterattack, they dropped back to their final line in that direction. And in that direction, there's another Confederate mass grave, which again, I'm not going to walk out to because they all look the same. The final attack on the Union would actually be half-hearted, and the Confederates were exhausted and they couldn't press it, and the daylight was gone. Well, where we are right now is the right of the Union. That would be the left of the Confederates. This is where they hastily assembled up on the first day. They've been battling and they've been pushed back. This is where they held and tried to force the Confederates back. This is actually where they initiated a counterattack, you know, after being pushed back from the Shiloh Church and even a bunch of the fields, Crescent Field, Duncan Field. They've been pushed back, and even the Hornets Nest, they pushed back here, and they reformed, and they decided to do a counterattack. The counterattack would actually fail, but would buy them time. And on the second day, this is where the Confederates were, when the Union came from up over there and counterattacked them and pushed them right off. The fresh troops of Buell's division made it overwhelming, and it was like they just overwhelmed the Confederates, even though they fought bravely, I guess. They bravely fought away. You can see there, as the Union troops fell back, all the things, back to the field. Here you can see the strategic location, right down there, where those guys are sitting. That's Pittsford's Crossing. So on the far bank, this is where Grant crossed his army. This was a strategic location. This was Grant's retreat. So this was what Johnson wanted to capture. If he had captured this point, he would have prevented any reinforcements from getting to Grant, and he would also prevented Grant from retreating. If you go down the river, there's basically a swamp. And that's where he was going to try and force Grant in and then force his surrender. Really just a couple hundred yards, like 200 yards up that way, is where the Confederate attack failed. All throughout that line were Grant's gunboats, and they were told to fire on the Confederates. So really, the Confederates were only a couple hundred yards from actually winning the whole battle. But they stopped. And you can see here Grant's plan. This is the landing, and he was going to take Corinth. If he takes Corinth, what happens is he cuts that rail line. Anything coming from Memphis, that was basically the way they got anything from Texas into the East Confederacy. If he takes that, he opens up the entire left, and then he only has to take Vicksburg, and he controls the Mississippi River. So he cuts this off. He cuts Memphis off pretty much. Well, if he takes it, he cuts Memphis off from sending rail or anything rail going east to the Confederacy. And then if he takes Vicksburg, he basically cuts the entire Confederacy in half. That's what was so important about this battle. So right here was the end of the line for the first day. So there was Munich's batteries. Grant had his final line right here, known as the final line. Obviously the bike is idling because turning it off and on so much is not good for it. From here, he actually had the advantage of his gunboats. Right over there is the river. His gunboats were parked right there, lobbing shells and increasing the artillery barrage. It was late in the day. The cavalry of both sides were worn out, and night was falling. Apparently, the Confederates attempted to storm. Many of them were out of ammunition, so they had to slide away and actually retreat. Yeah, so here's the start of day 2. Again, day 1 had most of the sites or whatnot that are on the app and on the battlefield. Second day, this is where the Union would start its advance back. With the gunboats over there firing, covering their advance, they attacked the Confederates right, this was the Union's left, and started to drive them back on the second day. Here we are, fresh divisions on the Confederate right. This is the left of the Union on the second day. This is Sarah Bell's farm. Now the thing about this was, they had just been through here the day before, and they found people had been lying and like even recovered wounded that had fallen the day before when they were first pushed through here. They attacked at 8 a.m. and they were probably a huge shock to the Confederates, who thought like the Grant was defeated. If you're curious, I have the bike idling because all the starting and stopping is not good for it. But yep, this was the extreme right. It's hard when you're on the battlefield to know which is the right and left all the time. Yep, so right here is an important marker. We got a Tennessee thing there. Another marker for all the regiments and people who fought here. But this is Beauregard's last stand. Beauregard takes over because Johnson's mortally wounded and dies on the first day of battle. He takes over. He thinks he has Grant whoop and it's just going to be a mop-up action. He's so confident that he writes a letter to Jefferson Davis talking about complete victory. The unfortunate thing is Buell arrives and he's counterattacked. So right here, Beauregard takes command of his own troops and leads a counterattack against the Union, hoping to drive them and still get victory. The unfortunate thing is the attack fails. He basically understands. He charges through the shallow water of a pond to my right, that pond right there, constantly going through it himself, trying to push the Union back, is easily repulsed, and then he realizes pretty much all is lost, that his troops are too exhausted and he's outnumbered too greatly to really to win the day, and he decides to do the battle's over and it's time to withdraw. Now Grant does not pursue him, the main reason being he's still under orders to not force an engagement. So he doesn't. So he lets the Confederates leave and instead starts to, reclaim his camps and to look what the Confederates took. Look at the deer out in the field, enjoying the battlefield. By mid-morning on the second day, the combined Union armies of the USS Grant and John Buell had advanced across the battlefield. Buell's center fought its way to this point, reclaiming the ground lost the day before. Here, Daniel Davis's wheat field. The Confederates struck back hard, catching the Federals in the deadly crossfire and driving them back for 2 hours. Fighting moved back and forth across the ground. At noon, reinforcements with the men of Grant's army. Buell reclaimed the initiative and pressed steady south and advanced to Beauregard's right and was unable to reverse it. Well, during this action, Todd Lincoln's half-brother was fatally wounded. Well, on this ground. The real thing about the battle is just the huge cost of it. It's just the enormity of the casualties, of the number of people who were died, and usually you take the number of people that died times 2, that's the wounded. And it was just a huge bloody mess all the way around, which actually even destroys the land, because just burying that many bodies actually causes issues with the land of plants growing.
And they picked this spot to...
That was the app you could have heard. But as you can see here, this is a Confederate soldier burial place, 1862. After the battle, the Union was tasked with, stayed a few days to clean up the dead, as it were, and bury the dead. And, well, with the Union soldiers, they did what they could to try and, you know, find families and to bury them. But with the Confederate dead, they were, well, they still wanted to honor it, but the Tennessee Division in 1935, that monument got here, but the dead were buried here in 1862. All in a mass grave right there. They really didn't know what to do with them. Well, not every single one of them, just the soldiers that fell in the area around here. Probably other ones in the area. And if you want to get in trouble, if you want to get into a lot of trouble, get caught digging there or waving a metal detector over it. Because they explicitly say that's a big no-no. There are actually 5 Confederate mass graves on the Shiloh military battlefield, and that has to do with the fact that, well, has to do with just how the Union did it. But are there others that are just summarily buried elsewhere? I would imagine so. I mean, what could you really do with that many dead just lying around? I'm sure there's like random people who were missed or just were buried right where they were because it would just been too inconvenient to move them to one place or the other. And that's truly the whole tragedy of it. Oh, this is just a little stream right where the Union set up camp for the first day's battle. You can see why. You know, you have access to fresh water, so it's a good place to camp. And there's a mass Confederate burial ground 0.2 miles there. But this is where the Union camp was started, where it was located. So this is just about the cost of battle. I guess the battle was done in April, you know, 6th and 7th, and they were still finding bodies in June. But here's a Confederate mass grave. The Union couldn't identify any of the Confederates because none of them wore, like, you know, nobody had an ID on them, so they didn't know where, if they could even send the you know, letters back or notifications of people who had died. So they had mass graves. Apparently, from what they say, there were 5. Only 5 were to have been discovered. Who knows how many others there are of mass graves. So I've seen 3 of them. And when they decided to make it a park in 1894. Now, the late 1800s is actually kind of interesting because that's right when you know, they started to notice there was like a tourism attraction to it. I think was the 30th anniversary of Gettysburg. 200,000 people showed up. They're like, oh my God, we can make money. We can make a historical monument to this. Really, I think you can get a lot by looking at these things because, one, you truly remember the history, and for people who are actually interested in military history, you know, this time frame, it can be a lot of fun. And this is definitely a worthwhile place to visit if you can.